The desert doesn't keep secrets. It buries them. Blood in the dust, bones under the mesquite, voices carried away by the wind. But sometimes the land itself seems to remember, and it cries out through those left behind. This is the story of a woman thrown into darkness and the man who chose to answer her voice, a choice that would damn him in the eyes of his people, but set him free in the eyes of his own soul. The desert never forgot the weight of blood. It clung to the sand, soaked into the cracked earth, and lingered in the silence between wind gusts. By noon, the Arizona sun was a merciless overseer, beating down on the dry well where they had cast her. Her name was Nalin, Apache by birth, warrior by necessity, and daughter of a people who had seen treaties broken, families scattered, and lives snuffed out like candle flames in the wind. Now she lay bruised at the bottom of a stone shaft, the smell of dust and iron in her nostrils, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. Her shoulders ached from where the men had dragged her, her ribs burning from the boots that had struck her. Above, the circle of sky mocked her, too far to reach, too bright to bear. She had screamed at first, her voice fierce with rage, carrying across the sagebrush plain. The men had laughed as they walked away, spitting tobacco and swearing she'd never climb out. But hours passed. The laughter faded. The sun kept rising. And her voice, proud at first, unbroken, began to splinter. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. By late afternoon, Nalin's throat was raw. Each cry came out hoarse, a shadow of sound swallowed by desert wind. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries mingling with hers. She pressed her forehead to the rough stones, whispering a prayer not for rescue, but for her spirit to walk the long trail to her ancestors with dignity. Then, faint but certain, she heard hooves, a single rider. The man was tall in the saddle, dust settling on his duster coat, his hat pulled low against the sun. He rode not with the easy pride of a rancher, nor the swagger of a lawman, but with the heavy stillness of someone carrying too many ghosts. Daniel McGraw, a rancher now, but once a cavalry scout, one of the men who had ridden hard and spilled blood in the Indian Wars. He had turned his back on that life, trying to bury the memories under cattle work and whiskey, but the past had a way of cutting through silence. He almost rode past. The well was nothing but a forgotten stone circle, half buried in weeds, but then he heard it, a ragged cry so faint it might have been the wind. He reined in his horse, listened. Again, a voice. Cracked, desperate, but still carrying the iron note of someone who refused to die quietly. Daniel swung down from his saddle. His boots crunched on gravel as he stepped toward the well. Peering down, he saw her, a dark figure against the pale, stone, hair tangled, eyes like embers still burning in the shadow. Their gazes locked. For a moment, time stilled. Daniel felt the old war press down on him, the raids, the ambushes, the blood spilled on both sides. He saw not just one woman, but 1,000 faces, men he had scouted against, families he had watched scatter, and in his chest, a wound opened, raw and unhealed. "Help me," she rasped, her voice breaking like glass. He should have walked away. Every law of the town, every warning from the sheriff, every unspoken code of neighbor and kin said she was an enemy, less than human, destined for the dirt. But Daniel wasn't sure if he believed in those laws anymore. He dropped to his knees, hands gripping the stone rim. "Hold on," he muttered, though she had no strength left to climb. The sun beat down. His horse snorted. And in that stillness, Daniel knew the moment mattered, not just for her, but for him. This was no stranger's cry. This was a reckoning. Back in town, men still spat her name like a curse, telling stories of raids, of barns burned, of wives and children lost. They had dragged her out after a skirmish at the edge of the San Pedro, deciding not to kill her with bullets, but with humiliation. A slow death. A spectacle no one had to watch. But Daniel McGraw had heard what they hadn't expected, the sound of her will refusing to die. He fetched a rope from his saddle, tied it off against the well stones, and lowered it down. His arms trembled as he braced against the pull of her weight. She was light but half dead, her hands slick with blood where the stone had cut her palms. "Climb," he ordered. She looked up at him, eyes sharp even through her weakness. "Why?" The single word cut deeper than a blade. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had no answer that would satisfy her or himself, so he simply said, "Because you're still breathing." And with that, he hauled. Stone scraped skin, rope burned palms, but inch by inch, Nalin rose. When at last she collapsed at the rim, gasping under the brutal sky, Daniel saw her not as an enemy, not as a symbol, but as a human being, bloodied, fierce and alive. For the first time in years, something cracked open inside him. The desert wind carried their silence, and the story began. The rope slid through his palms, coarse hemp biting into calloused skin as Daniel McGraw lowered himself into the black throat of the well. Above, the sky was a merciless disk of white fire, the desert sun glaring down. Below, the woman waited, in shadow, battered, parched, but her eyes burning like coals that refused to go out. The stones were hot against his boots, the air stale and thick. The farther he climbed down, the sharper the smell of dust, sweat, and iron blood became. Nalin had not moved since he had seen her from above. Yet as his shadow crossed her face, her gaze flicked upward, wary, defiant. Daniel's boots struck the bottom with a dull scrape. For a moment neither spoke. Only their breath filled the narrow chamber, his steady, hers ragged. "You came down," she rasped, voice like dry reeds in the wind. "I said I would." His words were steady, but inside him something twisted. She was his enemy. The very people he had once been ordered to hunt, yet no order bound him now, only choice. Her wrists were raw, torn by rope burns. Her cheek bore the purple bloom of a bruise, but it wasn't weakness that struck him. It was her eyes, still alive, still unyielding. "You think to save me?" she asked, bitterness coating the syllables. "I don't think," Daniel said, kneeling beside her. He untied the leather flask at his hip and pressed it toward her. "Drink." For a long heartbeat she refused, lips pressed tight. Then, too parched to resist, she tilted it back. Water spilled down her chin, soaking into her torn dress. She gasped and pushed it away. "You'll want me to thank you," she said. "But I won't." Daniel shook his head. "Don't need thanks." The truth was heavier. He wasn't sure why he was here, only that he couldn't walk past the sound of her voice without it tearing something in him open. When he wrapped the rope around her waist, she stiffened. "Trust me," he muttered. Her laugh was dry, cracked. "Trust? A white man? One of yours? Threw me down here." Daniel's jaw clenched. He thought of the townsfolk, men he knew, men who drank at the same saloon, men who had ridden with him on cattle drives, men who had laughed when they condemned her. "I'm not them," he said, though even as the words left him, doubt gnawed. He had been them once, hadn't he? He braced his legs against the stone and tugged on the rope. From above, his horse shifted, the tether creaking as Daniel hauled her upward. She climbed slowly, her hands trembling, her legs scraping stone. Twice she slipped, nails clawing rock, and Daniel steadied her with a firm grip. By the time they reached the rim, both were slick with sweat. Daniel scrambled out first, then leaned down to drag her over the edge. She collapsed on the ground, coughing, clutching at the dry grass. The desert stretched wide around them, endless sand, brittle sage, the far-off shimmer of mesas. And on the horizon, dust plumes marked riders. The town. Daniel glanced that way and knew eyes were on him. The first of the townsmen appeared not half an hour later. Two riders, rifles resting easy across their laps, trotted close enough to spit and jeer. "McGraw," one called. "You gone soft? Pulling savages out."
"Of holes now?"
Daniel stood tall, sweat running down his temple, hand resting casual near his revolver. "She was left for dead," he said, voice steady. That was the point. The man spat tobacco into the dirt. You keep her, she'll slit your throat, in your sleep. Behind him, Nalin pushed herself to sitting, eyes hard as flint. She said nothing, but her silence was heavier than words. Daniel's chest burned with shame and anger. The man who mocked him had never seen what he'd seen. Villages torched under military banners, children wailing over the bodies of their mothers. She's coming with me, Daniel said. The riders exchanged looks, laughter sharp in the hot air. Your funeral. They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising in their wake. By dusk, Daniel had lifted Nalin onto his own horse, walking beside her as the animal carried them across the open plain. She swayed in the saddle but did not fall, stubborn pride, keeping her upright. Why risk this? She asked suddenly, her voice carrying over the rhythmic clop of hooves. Your people will turn against you. They already have, Daniel answered. She studied him, suspicion and curiosity mingling in her gaze. Then why? He stopped walking, his eyes on the blood-red horizon. The truth pressed at his chest, bitter as bile. Because I've done worse than what they did to you, he said finally. And I can't stomach one more sin. Silence stretched between them, long and heavy. She looked away, lips pressed tight, but he caught the flicker in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Night fell by the time they reached his ranch, a lonely stretch of land marked by a sagging barn, a split-rail fence, and a cabin crouched against the hills. Daniel lifted her down, guiding her inside where the air was cooler, the scent of pine smoke lingering. She sank onto a chair, arms crossed tight. Even in her exhaustion, she held herself like a warrior, refusing to show weakness. You want me to believe you're different, she said. But you wore their uniform once. I can see it in your eyes. Daniel's breath caught. She was right. He had ridden in the blue coat, scouted Apache trails, watched soldiers burn homes. Her people's hatred of him was earned. I did, he admitted, and I can't change that. But I can choose what I do now. For the first time, she looked at him not with pure contempt, but with something sharper. A question unspoken, as though testing the edges of his soul. She said nothing more, only closed her eyes, her body finally giving way to exhaustion. Daniel stood over her, fists tight at his sides, knowing full well what he had just done. Defied his neighbors, defied his own past. The burden of it pressed down on him, heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt something else too, a chance at redemption. The desert had its own kind of silence, not the soft quiet of forests or rivers, but a silence made of wind and distance, broken only by the cry of hawks or the yipping of coyotes at night. At Daniel McGraw's ranch, that silence pressed against the cabin walls like another presence one neither of them could ignore. The days bled one into another. Daniel tended to his cattle, repaired the fences, hauled water from the creek. Nalin remained near the cabin, her body recovering but her spirit ever alert, like a caged hawk waiting for a chance to strike or fly. She would sit on the porch, arms folded, watching him move through the chores with quiet suspicion. The first time she spoke of her past, it was by accident. A scar along her forearm had reopened while she was grinding maize Daniel had brought from town. Blood welled up. Daniel moved instinctively, kneeling beside her with a rag. She jerked away, eyes flashing. Don't touch me. I know what your kind does when they touch us, she snapped, her words sharp as flint. Daniel froze, rag in hand. Silence stretched. Then, softer, almost a whisper, she added, The soldiers came to our camp at night. Said it was a peace talk. My father spoke with them. He was a chief, a good man. They shot him where he stood. Then the fire spread. She pressed the rag to her arm herself, her jaw set. Daniel lowered his eyes. The memory that rose in him was too close, too familiar. He saw fire licking at Wickiup, smoke rising against the stars, soldiers shouting, women crying. He had scouted that raid. He had watched from the shadows as the cavalry did its work, his orders clear. Find their camp. Lead us there. I was there. he said quietly, the words tasting of ash. Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing to burning slits. You! I didn't fire a shot, he said quickly, but I led them. I told myself it was duty, that it was the army's war, not mine. But I knew what it would mean. Her silence was worse than her anger. She looked at him as though she could see every ghost clinging to him, every drop of blood on his conscience. You should have left me in that well, she said at last. Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe I should have. But I couldn't. Nights were colder in the desert, the fire crackling inside the hearth, shadows dancing on the rough-hewn walls. Daniel would sit at the table, mending tack or oiling his rifle, while Nalin lay on a blanket near the flames, pretending to sleep. But he could feel her eyes open in the dark, always watching. One night, when the coyotes sang loud enough to make the boards hum, she spoke again. Do you know what it is, to carry the dead inside you? Daniel set down the rifle slowly. Yes. She turned her face toward the flames, her features carved in orange and shadow. My brothers, my mother, all of them gone in one night. Sometimes I hear them still in the wind. Sometimes I wish I had burned with them. The honesty of her voice struck something in him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I see faces, too. The ones I led men to. Sometimes I wake choking, on smoke that isn't there. I drink to make it quiet, but it always comes back. Her eyes flicked to him then, measuring. Not pitying, not forgiving. Just seeing him, stripped bare of pretense. They spoke little more that night. But something shifted in the silence, a thread woven between them, fragile yet undeniable. Days passed. Trust was not given. It was fought for, clawed at in the dirt like survival itself. When Daniel left her alone at the ranch to ride into town for supplies, he half expected her to be gone when he returned. But she was there, waiting on the porch, bow in hand, arrows she had carved from cedar stakes. You've got skill, he admitted, nodding to the feathered shafts. I had. To learn young, she replied coldly, or die. Later, she watched him break a young horse in the corral, his body moving with the animal's buck and twist until both man and beast were drenched in sweat. When the horse finally yielded, Nalin's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. You. Treat him different than your people treat mine, she said. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. A horse only breaks if you beat it. Same with people. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. One evening, a storm rolled across the desert. Rain hammered the roof, the air thick with ozone. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin. In sharp flashes, they sat close to the fire, the storm shaking the walls. Where will you go? Daniel asked over the roar of rain. My people are scattered, Nalin said softly. Those not dead are hiding in the mountains, hunted like wolves. If I go to them, I bring danger with me. If I stay here... She looked around the cabin, eyes hard. Your kind will come. They will kill me. And maybe you too. Daniel's chest tightened. Then what do you want? Her gaze lingered on him. To live. To breathe free air. To walk where no one hunts me. Her voice broke then. Just slightly. She turned away, but Daniel had already seen the glint of tears she fought to hide. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. For a moment she resisted, then let his rough fingers close over hers. Her skin was warm, calloused from labor, trembling but strong. The fire popped, sparks drifting upward. The moment stretched, heavy with what could never be spoken. They didn't speak of love. That would have been a lie too large, too dangerous. But in the quiet, in the glances that lingered too long, in the hands that brushed while passing tools, or water, something unspoken grew. One night, beneath a sky littered with stars, Daniel sat on the porch sipping from a tin cup. Nalin stepped outside, her hair loose, dark against the silver of moonlight. You watch the sky like it has answers, she said. Sometimes it feels like it should, Daniel replied. They sat in silence, the desert stretching endless before. Them. A coyote called in the distance, lonely, mournful. Your people and mine, Nalin said at last. We will never share peace. Daniel turned to her, the moonlight catching in her eyes. Maybe not. But you and I, maybe we can share a night. Her breath caught, not in shock but in recognition of what was already there. She didn't answer, only let the silence speak for her. In the isolation of that ranch, survival bound them first. Pain tied them second, and something dangerous, tender, forbidden, began to weave between the cracks of their broken pasts. Both knew the world would never allow it. But under desert stars, with only the coyotes as witnesses, two enemies found in each other a reflection, and the faint, impossible glimmer of hope. The town was quieter than usual that morning, the kind of quiet that meant trouble brewing. Dust swirled along Main Street, pushed by a dry wind that rattled the shutters of the saloon. Daniel McGraw rode in alone, hat low, his shoulders heavy, with more than the saddle. He had left Nalin at the ranch, though her wary eyes had followed him long after he disappeared into the horizon. Daniel dismounted outside the mercantile, tying off his horse. He needed supplies, flour, salt, tobacco, the kind of things that could keep the two of them fed in isolation. But he also knew eyes would be on him. The men in town hadn't forgotten what he'd done at the well. Sheriff Amos Caldwell stood across the street, his badge catching the light like a shard of steel. He was leaning against the post outside his office, boots dusty, arms crossed. His eyes, pale, cold, rimmed with bitterness, locked on Daniel the moment he stepped into view. Daniel froze. Memories cut sharp as spurs. Riding beside Caldwell, years ago in cavalry blue, the man's laugh carrying across campfires, his rifle always ready. They had fought the same war, but where Daniel had sought to bury the past, Caldwell had built his life out of its bones. Caldwell pushed off the post and walked across the street, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. Heard tell you've been playing savior, the sheriff said, his voice low, mocking. That true, Danny boy? Dragging an Apache out of her grave? Daniel's jaw tightened. She's no one's grave to dig. Caldwell's mouth curved into something between a smile and a snarl. You forget who she is, what she is. That woman's blood's been spilling ours since before you and I wore the same coat. Daniel's hand hovered near his belt but not on his gun. And you forget who you are. Sheriff now, Amos. You're supposed to uphold the law, not throw women into wells. The sheriff's eyes flickered, a brief crack in his armor, then gone. He leaned close, voice sharp as broken glass. The law don't matter when it comes to them. You know that. You always knew. Daniel stared at him, seeing not the sheriff but the soldier he had once known, a man who had let war rot his soul from the inside. No, Amos. That's the difference between us. I knew, and I hated myself for it. You knew, and you fed on. For a long moment they stood, the street empty, the wind tugging at their coats. Then Caldwell stepped back, but his words cut deep. You bring her here again, McGraw, and I won't bother with Wells. You'll both hang. Daniel left town with supplies in his saddlebags and Caldwell's threat burning in his ears. The desert, ride back to the ranch, felt endless. Every ridge, every dust cloud made him tighten his grip on the reins. When he reached the cabin, Nalin was waiting on the porch. She didn't ask what he had seen. She read it in his face. Who was it? She demanded. Daniel tied off his horse, his silence heavy. Finally, he met her gaze. Sheriff Amos Caldwell, he was there. One of the men who... He faltered, unable to finish. Her eyes narrowed, fury simmering beneath the surface. Then he's no different than the soldiers who burned my home. The word struck like a hammer. Daniel forced himself to sit, the weight of truth pressing him down. He rode with me once, back when I scouted for the army. We led them to camps, to your people. Nalin's body went rigid. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over him like a blade. My father was promised peace, a treaty. He went unarmed to speak, Instead, bullets tore him down in front of us. Her voice cracked, raw with memory. "Were you there, McGraw? Did your boots stand in that circle?" Daniel's throat closed. The firelight of memory filled his vision. A chief standing proud, hands raised in good faith, the sudden roar of rifles, the echo of screams. "Yes," he whispered. Her hand flew, striking him across the face. The sound cracked sharp in the air. His cheek stung, but he didn't move. He couldn't. "You killed him," she spat, tears hot in her eyes. "Maybe not with your bullet, but with your path, your maps, your lies." Daniel bowed his head. "I did. And I've lived every day since with that weight." Silence roared between them, louder than any gunshot. Nalin's breath came fast, her fists trembling at her sides. Daniel sat waiting for her to leave, to curse him, to take his horse and vanish into the desert. But she didn't. Instead, after a long, searing moment, she sank onto the porch steps, her face turned away. Her voice, when it came, was ragged. "Then you understand why I cannot forgive, not yet." Daniel lifted his eyes to her, the fire of guilt and something more burning in his chest. "I don't ask forgiveness. I ask only to stand beside you against men like Caldwell, to keep you alive." Nalin looked at him then, her eyes red but unbroken. "Alive is not enough. Not after what was taken." The night fell heavy around them, coyotes howling in the distance. Two enemies sat side by side, the ghosts of their pasts pressing close, binding them in pain and bitter truth. And though the bond between them shook, cracked by revelation, it did not break. Not yet. The first sign was dust, a thick brown plume curling up on the horizon, rolling toward Daniel's ranch like a storm. Daniel stood on the porch, rifle across his arms, watching the dust cloud grow. He didn't need to count riders. He already knew who would be leading them. Amos Caldwell had never let a grudge settle into silence. Behind him, Nalin stepped into the doorway. Her dark hair was tied back, her face marked not by fear, but by the calm of someone who had already stared into death once and refused to bow. "They come for me," she said simply. Daniel didn't turn. His voice was steady, but his stomach coiled like barbed wire. "They come for both of us now." The riders appeared a few minutes later. 8 men, rifles glinting, faces set with the determination of those convinced they were carrying out justice. At their head rode Sheriff Caldwell, his long coat whipping in the wind, badge flashing like a shard of ice. They reined in just beyond rifle range. Caldwell's voice carried across the desert. "McGraw, you've got something that don't belong to you. Hand her over and we'll let you live quiet. Refuse and we'll burn you out with the rest of the vermin." Daniel raised the rifle, not aiming yet, but letting them see the decision was already made. "She ain't yours to claim, Amos. And she damn sure ain't mine. She's free, and that's the end of it." A murmur went through the men, some shifting. In their saddles, Caldwell just laughed, the sound dry as rattlesnake scales. "You always were soft, Danny. Out on campaign I saw you falter, saw you choke. Thought maybe you'd learn that pity gets men killed. But look at you now, throwing your lot in with the very devils who butchered our kin." Nalin stepped forward, standing beside Daniel on the porch, her chin high. "Your kin butchered first," she called, her voice like flint. "My father went with open hands. Your soldiers filled them with blood." The words cut through the air sharper than any bullet. Caldwell's smile faltered, but his eyes turned to Daniel. "You telling me she ain't twisted your head around?" "She's poison, Danny boy. You can't wash Apache blood off her skin. You stand with her, you're a traitor to every man here." Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. His voice came low, steady as bedrock. "Then I reckon I'm a traitor." The first shot cracked from the posse, tearing into the porch rail. Splinters flew. Daniel shoved Nalin down, dropped to one knee, and fired back. His bullet struck the dirt at the hooves of Caldwell's horse, forcing the animal to rear. The line of riders broke in chaos, some scattering wide, others dismounting to take cover in the rocks. Gunfire roared, echoing across the canyon. Dust lifted with every impact, the air stinking of powder. Nalin scrambled for the rifle Daniel had, kept propped against the wall inside. When she stepped back out, weapon in hand, Daniel's eyes flicked to her in surprise. She met his look with defiance. "I will not hide," she said. Before he could protest, she braced against the porch post and fired. One of the riders yelped and fell, his leg torn open. She reloaded with swift, practiced motions. This was no stranger to the ways of war. Daniel realized then, she was not a burden. She was a blade, sharpened by survival. Caldwell's voice rose above the crack of rifles. "You're digging your grave, McGraw. You think she'll thank you? She'll slit your throat the first chance she gets." Daniel fired again, forcing Caldwell back behind a rock outcrop. His own voice rang clear through the haze. "I ain't doing this for thanks. I'm doing it 'cause it's right. Something you forgot how to be." The fight raged. Bullets thudded into the walls of the cabin, shattering glass. Daniel and Nalin moved as one, covering each other, reloading, ducking fire. Her hands shook at times, but her aim was true. His breath came ragged, but his will hardened with every shot. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The posse's confidence began to falter. 2 men were down, another wounded. The desert heat pressed hard, sucking sweat and strength from them. But Caldwell remained, his hatred burning brighter than the sun. At last he stood tall from behind, cover revolver in hand, his voice raw. "You can't change what you are, McGraw. You're one of us whether you like it or not. And she," he gestured toward Nalin with his gun, "she'll never see you as anything but the butcher who led us to her kin. You think she'll love you for this? She'll despise you till your dying breath." Daniel lowered his rifle, eyes locked on Caldwell. The words struck deep because they were true. Part of them, at least, but truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was choice. "I don't need her love, Amos," Daniel called back, voice ringing with finality. "I just need her to live." Nalin's hand brushed his arm then, firm, grounding. Her eyes met his, fierce, unyielding. "You are wrong," she whispered, just for him. "I do not despise you, not anymore." It was enough. Together they raised their rifles and fired. Caldwell staggered back, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. His revolver slipped from his grasp, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Fell to his knees, eyes wide in disbelief, then toppled face first into the dust. The remaining men looked to one another, fear breaking whatever loyalty Caldwell had commanded. One by one they mounted up and fled, leaving the sheriff's body behind. Silence reclaimed the desert, broken only by the rasp of Daniel's breathing and the echo of Nalin's pounding heart. Smoke drifted from their rifles. The porch was scarred, the cabin walls peppered with holes, but they still stood. Daniel sank onto the steps, rifle across his knees. Nalin lowered herself beside him, their shoulders brushing, both staring out at the body lying in the sand. Neither spoke for a long while. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in fire and ash. At last, Daniel broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "There'll be more. They won't forgive this." Nalin's eyes were fixed on the horizon where the last light bled into darkness. "Then we fight again, or we run. But never again will I be thrown into a hole to die." Daniel turned to her, seeing not just the survivor, but the warrior, the woman whose spirit had outlasted cruelty and betrayal. And in that moment, though the world had branded them enemies, they were bound by something stronger than blood. They were bound by choice. The desert night had a way of swallowing men whole. Smoke still curled faint from the ruined porch behind them, the smell of gunpowder clinging to their clothes. Daniel's shoulder was torn from a graze, blood seeping through his shirt. Nalin's arm was bandaged in strips of cloth, her skin streaked with dust and sweat. Yet both stood, alive, staring out at the dark horizon where the land stretched endless under the rising moon. They did not speak at first. The silence was heavier than words, filled with the weight of choices made and lives lost. Behind them lay a town that would never welcome them again, a grave where Amos Caldwell would lie cold, and a people who would spit Daniel's name like poison. Ahead was nothing but wilderness. Daniel tightened the cinch on his horse, wincing as pain shot through his wound. Nalin steadied him with a touch. Brief, practical, but carrying more than either dared say. "You could stay," she murmured. "Say you were forced, they might forgive you." Daniel met her eyes, the silver moonlight cutting his face into shadow and steel. "Forgive me? No. They'll never forgive. And I don't want it anymore." He paused, breath rough. "Redemption? Don't come from them. Maybe it don't come at all, but it sure as hell ain't found by handing you back." Something shifted in Nalin's gaze. Not trust born overnight, but recognition. She had seen men lie with promises before. This one was different. He was walking away from everything he knew, and doing it for her. They rode out together before dawn, the desert wind carrying the last echoes of gunfire into nothingness. The land stretched wide, painted silver by starlight, the horizon broken only by the shadow of jagged mountains. Coyotes sang in the distance, and their horses' hooves fell like muffled drums across the hardpan earth. Daniel's body ached, every breath burning, but the rhythm of the ride steadied him. At his side, Nalin rode upright, her silhouette carved, against the sky, proud even in weariness. She was no fugitive clinging to a rescuer. She was a survivor, a leader in exile, and he was simply the man who had chosen to walk with her into darkness. At a creek bed, they stopped to water the horses. Daniel lowered himself onto a rock, breathing hard. Nalin knelt beside him, checking the wound at his shoulder. Her hands were sure, unflinching. "You'll carry the scar," she said quietly. Daniel gave a dry half-smile. "I've carried worse." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a heartbeat, the space between them throbbed with all that had been unspoken. Grief, guilt, fire, the fragile thread of something almost tender. But neither reached across that line. The world would not permit it, and perhaps neither of them fully trusted it yet. Instead, Nalin bound his shoulder tight, then sat back, her face turned toward the wide desert sky. "You left your people for me. That choice, it binds us. Not as master and captive, as exiles, together." Daniel followed her gaze upward. The stars burned fierce above, cold and eternal, watching as men and women below carved fleeting stories into the dust. By dawn, the desert began to glow with pale fire, shadows stretching long. They mounted once more, side by side, and rode west, toward the mountains. Two silhouettes against a horizon that promised no safety, no home, only survival. Daniel knew there would be no return. His land, his neighbors, the lies he had once lived by, all gone. What remained was uncertain, but it was honest. For Nalin, the road ahead was exile, but it was also freedom. She had been thrown into a hole to die. Now she rode tall, scars gleaming, spirit unbroken. They did not need words as the sun crested the ridge and painted them gold. The world would remember them only in whispers, if at all, but in that moment under the vast sky, they were not enemies, nor prisoner and savior. They were two souls bound by choice, riding into legend. The desert wind rose, carrying their silence into eternity. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.